I found that insulin resistance was a foundational cause to virtually every chronic disease, what I now refer to as the plagues of prosperity.
Today's episode is with Dr. Ben Bikman, who is a professor and researcher in insulin resistance, and I think you're going to find it really informative. We are talking all about insulin resistance and helping you really understand what it is and why it matters. So we do get a little sciencey at the beginning. Be sure you stay tuned till the end where we wrap it up and really give you specific things of what you can do to improve and prevent insulin resistance in your own health. He's got a great book called Why We Get Sick and also some really helpful tips on his website, benbikman.com, or his social, Ben Bikman, PhD. I hope you enjoy.
Heart disease, forms of cancer, the most common liver problem, fatty liver disease, the most common forms of infertility, high blood pressure, even certain skin disorders that are increasingly common. As much as these seem like totally distinct, unrelated problems, I found that there was substantial evidence to suggest that they all had one thing in common, namely insulin resistance.
Thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to meet you and talk with you.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm delighted.
Well, we're not going to waste too much time here. We're going to dig in, but I do want to tell listeners a little bit about you. So Ben has his PhD in bioenergetics and works currently as a professor and researcher at Brigham Young University, which is also my alma mater. So we're happy to connect.
Yeah, go Cougs.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let's just go ahead and dive in. Would you start by just hitting us off with why is this topic so important, especially insulin resistance, but the bigger picture of metabolic health?
Right. Yeah. I confess part of my answer is in fact my own journey, my own evolution, which is this focus on insulin resistance. When I first began my academic career, my pursuit of becoming a scientist and a research professor, I thought I only was focusing on the connection between obesity and type 2 diabetes. And the bridge that connects those two phenomena is insulin resistance. So insulin resistance I considered just to be the great mediator between fat getting too much or too big and type 2 diabetes. And then as I continued to kind of dive down into that topic, which is what you do with science, you usually pick a field and just go deeper and deeper, I found that insulin resistance was also a foundational cause to virtually every chronic disease, what I now refer to as the plagues of prosperity. Heart disease, the most common forms of cancer, the most common liver problem, fatty liver disease, the most common forms of infertility, high blood pressure, even certain skin disorders that are increasingly common. As much as these seem like totally distinct, unrelated problems, I found that there was substantial evidence to suggest that they all had one thing in common, namely insulin resistance. So to sum all of that up, insulin resistance is relevant to every non-infectious chronic disease. But to make matters even worse and to justify my own professional expertise, it is also the most prevalent problem where there was a paper published just a handful of years ago that found that up to 88% of all adults in the US have some manifestation or symptom of insulin resistance, like high blood pressure or high blood glucose, or, along those lines. And as much as we like to think it's a uniquely kind of American attribute to think that America is the fattest and the worst, and that is just not true. I've just over the past week gave a talk about insulin resistance in Morocco and Sweden. And a month before that, I gave a talk in Japan and Thailand. So this is an absolute global problem. So global proportions, making insulin resistance the single most common health problem worldwide. And then again, putting it in perspective even further, it then contributes to all of these chronic diseases.
That's so helpful. So we are going to be talking about specifically insulin resistance and metabolic health in women. And hopefully by the end of this, people will feel pretty good about knowing how to go about finding out if they have insulin resistance and have some sort of action strategy for what to do about it and why this matters so much. So I'm excited to break it down. I think it's helpful to first clarify a couple definitions because everyone has heard about this now, but I still think it can be really confusing. Will you break down probably those two definitions to start with of insulin resistance and metabolic health?
Yeah, wonderful. Right. So let's start with metabolic health because that term gets thrown around very, very readily. And in fact, I would suggest maybe too readily, at least without people appreciating it. So metabolic health, one common way of defining it would be through the lens of the metabolic syndrome, which is another thing people have heard of. The metabolic syndrome is this cluster of complications that kind of always tends to clump together. And this is, having a little too much fat around the belly, high blood pressure, high blood glucose, and then your blood lipids, your triglycerides and your HDL cholesterol are a little off. Those are the things that tend to just come together. However, before it was ever called the metabolic syndrome, it was called the insulin resistance syndrome. That was one of the original terms for this observation of these problems that clump together. And then insulin resistance is really a pathology with two parts, or as I like to say, it's a coin with two sides. One side of the coin is the resistance to insulin. And insulin is a hormone that flows through the blood, and it has the ability to affect every single cell of the body, which is not common, but literally every single cell of the body has insulin receptors, these little doorways that are specifically designed for insulin to come and knock on the door. Some of those cells stop answering the door. So that's the insulin resistance part. Now, as I noted, that's only one side of the coin. To really appreciate insulin resistance, especially with women and fertility, as we'll get to, you have to flip the coin over and consider the other side of it, which is every time you talk about insulin resistance, you are also talking about hyperinsulinemia or elevated blood insulin levels. There is no insulin resistance without hyperinsulinemia. Those two things are just locked at the hip. They come together. And again, when it comes to female physiology with pregnancy and infertility, these two opposites, you actually have these they are each a unique manifestation of insulin resistance with its two parts.
And also, I'll add on to that menopause, right? We see these rising levels of insulin resistance then when the hormones go away.
That's right.
Those female hormones or those sex hormones are pretty closely integrated with the controls for the insulin.
Yeah, especially estradiol, the main of the kind of poster child of the estrogens. Estradiol is, I've sort of joked previously that it allows the woman to be a metabolic superhero. Mm-hmm. That when the estradiol goes away, now she's immortal, like her unfortunate male counterparts who've always been subject to the frailties of metabolic mortality. But as long as the woman has those premenopausal estradiol levels, she's kind of bulletproof metabolically.
Yeah. Well, I won't argue with that. I like that definition. So tell us one more time. So the insulin is a messenger, right? And it's going and knocking on the door. What message is it trying to deliver? Because I think when we talk about this, it's really easy to demonize or, to say like, oh, I got it. Insulin, bad guy. I don't want insulin, right? Like everything when we talk about anything in the body, basically, it's in moderation, right? There's too much of a good thing or not enough. What is it trying to tell the body?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you framed the question that way. As much as I kind of have a career looking at insulin as the villain, it is absolutely a molecule of life, and that the absence of insulin, in other words, an untreated person with type 1 diabetes, is a death sentence. Mm-hmm. And that's because of what insulin does. Back to the question, we often look at insulin strictly through the lens of controlling glucose or blood sugar. People, in fact, indeed, even very experienced clinicians think that insulin has no more relevance than its control of blood sugar levels, which is just fantastically unfair because insulin will stimulate dozens of different effects at different cells of the body. In fact, the number of cells that will pull in blood sugar or blood glucose in response to insulin is actually just 2 or 3. But all the other cells of the body still need insulin to tell it. And so here's the thematic answer. When insulin knocks at the door of every cell of the body, brain cells to bone cells, lung cells to liver cells, the common message is, although it can be personalized to cell type, is I'm here to tell you what to do with the energy that you have right now and that is out here in the blood with me as I'm coming in. That is the thematic effect of insulin. At every cell of the body, it's just saying, hey, I've got some energy here, and to really put a fine point on it, I need you to store it. Mm-hmm. That is the thematic effect. Even in those cells where insulin isn't necessary for the glucose to come in, and just to be really precise, when insulin comes to fat cells, and there's glucose out ready to come in, blood glucose has gone high. The blood glucose cannot get into those fat cells until insulin comes and knocks on the door, and then the door opens. Now the glucose can come into the fat cell. In contrast, the liver cell, it can pull in glucose the moment glucose starts going up, but it won't know what to do with it. In the absence of insulin, it'll pull it in and let it out, pull it in and let it out. It won't actually hold on to it. So insulin will come and knock on the door, even though there's glucose rushing in the open door right next to it, and will say, hey, you're pulling in glucose. This is what I want you to do with it. I want you to hold on to it, turn it into glycogen, because you're going to want that later for when we stop eating glucose.
So in a good situation, of course, we want that insulin to tell our cells exactly how to process energy, which is metabolism, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you're describing. So we get energy in through food, generally through food. And then the insulin tells the cells, hey, good, we've got energy here. Let's save this or use it for the rest of our body functions, for thinking, for our heartbeat, for all of the mm-hmm. functions that are keeping us alive. Now, where does this go awry? There's a cue then that cues the insulin to start saying that too much. And mm-hmm. then, so what is that cue? And then how does that start to cause this cascade of badness? Yeah.
So transitioning here then from now that hopefully everyone feels like they have a pretty good understanding of insulin and insulin resistance, then it is fun to kind of move into the origin story. If insulin resistance is the villain, how did it break bad? How did it become such a bad guy? So insulin resistance, again, this two-part pathology, insulin resistance at some cells of the body, not all cells become insulin resistant, but combined with the hyperinsulinemia, I generally describe, or my own classification system has sort of brought me to the conclusion that there are primary causes of insulin resistance, and then there are secondary causes. For the sake of time, we'll just put the secondary to the side. The primary causes are ones that are each capable of causing insulin resistance, not only on their own, so they're each independent, but they've also been shown to cause insulin resistance in every studied biomedical model. Now, what I mean by that is when a biomedical scientist is publishing results from research, we are using cells that are growing in little petri dishes, or we are using laboratory rodents, or we're using humans. So these three primary causes of insulin resistance have each been shown to cause insulin resistance in all three of those biomedical models. Now, with that as a very long-winded warm-up to it, they are stress and inflammation and too much insulin. And if you'll allow me, I'll just briefly kind of define them. So with stress, I mentioned stress as a professor who teaches a graduate class in endocrinology. So I'm just fascinated by the hormones. And you can't really understand stress without understanding hormones. Mm-hmm. Stress is hormones, namely epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and cortisol. And there's some other inputs there too, but those are the big boys. They're the main ones. So it's cortisol and epinephrine. Now, as much as we call them stress hormones, they're actually very different. They come from different cell types. They come from different origins. They're different types of hormones. They are carried in the blood in very different ways. They actually act on the receiving tissues in very different ways. So they actually have very little in common. The one pronounced thing they have in common is that they both increase blood glucose and do so very, very strongly. That means that they become antagonistic to insulin, whose most famous job, but I won't say most important, whose most famous job is to lower the blood glucose. And so the more those stress hormones are elevated, the more insulin's having to work harder, and we have come to insulin resistance. And this is a phenomenon that happens quite quickly. Each of those stress hormones can have both shared stimuli and distinct stimuli. Like too much caffeine is going to stimulate epinephrine a little more. Poor sleep is going to stimulate cortisol a little more. Fasting is going to be a little more epinephrine at first, and then a little more cortisol, and then those will generally subside. But even still, they kind of play together a little bit. But suffice to say, when those hormones are up, there may be a little bit of insulin resistance, if only temporarily. Then second is inflammation. Very briefly, anytime the body has elevated levels of these inflammatory proteins called cytokines, which it can be elevated from an illness like infection or an autoimmune disease or inhaled pollutant particles, then that will once again stimulate a degree of insulin resistance. And then the third one is the one I believe is the most relevant in most people, which is too much insulin. And now the astute listener may start to envision this sort of vicious cycle, and that's exactly what's happening, where too much insulin is both a feature of insulin resistance, but it's also a cause and a consequence. So if your body isn't responding very well to insulin, no surprise that the body starts making more. But at the same time, too frequently spiking insulin levels is a way for the body to just start to become deaf to the signal. It's like the person who's constantly listening to really loud music, you become deaf. That's like the cells that are constantly inundated with insulin, you become deaf to the signal. And that's largely driven to just the way we eat. We kind of have two main problems, and this sort of starts to touch on the solution, but I promise I won't get ahead of the conversation here. But
Spoiler.
we just have a culture, particularly where you and I are here in Utah, it really is particularly apparent, where we have a constant carbohydrate consumption and we just feast too frequently. So we eat overwhelmingly, what goes in our mouth is refined starches and sugars, whether we're eating them or drinking them, and we're doing it way too often. And that means as we're spiking our blood sugar, we're spiking our insulin, and insulin can take 4 or 5 hours to come back down. And long before then, we've already spiked it up again. And so we live in a culture where most people spend every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. From the moment they wake up, they eat or drink something sugary and starchy, and that just sets the tone, the metabolic tone for the rest of the day and even well into the evening. And so that I end with that one, that the most important one I contend is the chronic elevations in insulin.
Yes. Wow. Such a great instruction on all of that. I think just to reiterate, that last part is you eat the glucose, and the body's idea is to take that energy and go do something with it. Mm-hmm. So it's not a flawed system in and of itself, but we eat energy and the body's like, got it. Okay. Insulin comes in and says, here's what we're going to do with this. If we keep giving the body the wrong cues, which is glucose, amongst other things, and then it starts to become additive, where you have really processed foods that are spiking glucose in addition to stress, in addition to inflammation, and then you have lack of sleep, which is more stress. And you start having all of these components add on to each other. All of those are just cueing the insulin to go up, up, up. And meanwhile, the cells, like you said, are starting to become deaf. Mm-hmm. So what happens to the insulin then? The insulin goes up even further so it can yell to get those cells to respond, and around it goes until we get that insulin resistance. Since we're talking right now, do you want to comment? Maybe this is the right time to comment on how the sex hormones, even just briefly, kind of what is their role in this with estrogen and lack of estrogen? Yeah.
So estradiol being the main of the estrogens, which is particularly relevant here, but I also have to bring in another one, which is progesterone. Mm-hmm. And of course, this part of the conversation is very relevant to premenopausal women, because then with the loss of ovulation comes a substantial change in those hormones with menopause. To answer this, I almost have to revisit the causes of insulin resistance, because the three primary causes that I described are very acute stimuli. Like you can take a human and within 24 hours make them insulin resistant by giving them too much insulin or stress hormones or inflammation. But just as quickly as that can settle in, if you remove that stimulus, you remove the insulin resistance. So it's a very acute on and off. Now, of course, in many instances, it's just chronically on. So to really understand the role of the sex hormones, particularly in women, we actually have to bring in the fat cell, at the risk of making it all a little more complicated, but a little more compelling at the same time, I hope. But the fat cell is the tissue primarily responsible for chronic insulin resistance. So when a person has an insulin resistance that is deeply set in and is now going to take a few months to resolve, at that point, we're really talking about the fat cell. And so briefly, when a human gains fat, they can gain fat through two different ways. They can gain fat through a process of the fat cell multiplying, which is called hyperplasia, or they can gain fat through a process of the fat cell number staying the same, just each individual fat cell is getting bigger and bigger. That's called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is the way we most often gain weight, and it is the most harmful because as the fat cell gets bigger and bigger, it starts to become insulin resistant in order to try to stop growing. It's basically like a water balloon that we've had connected to the tap, and we're letting it get bigger and bigger and bigger. We can tell it's going to burst soon. We don't want it to burst, so we turn the tap off. The fat cell starts to reach a point of maximum dimension, and this can be well over 100 times the volume of when it started growing. And there's no cell in the body that is capable of growing like the fat cell can grow. Nothing comes even close. So this big fatty balloon is just getting bigger and bigger, almost to the point of bursting, and it's insulin telling it to get big. It is literally impossible, as a brief little aside, it is literally impossible for a fat cell to grow in the absence of an insulin stimulus. You can feed fat cells all or expose it to all the calories you want, and if insulin is low, it cannot get big. It is totally impossible. This is why some type 1 diabetics tragically learn that if they deliberately underdose their insulin, they can eat as much as they want. And now, there's metabolic havoc as a consequence of this, and it is absolutely catastrophic. But if their only motivation is to be thin, well, then they have total control over that because of what's in that little insulin syringe. That's an eating disorder called diabulimia, just as a tangent. So the fat cell's getting bigger and bigger, and it starts to tell insulin, if I continue to grow, I'm literally going to rupture, and we don't want that. That's going to be very messy and inflammatory, and it's a bad way to die. None of us want this, so I'm going to become insulin resistant, and I'm going to stop listening to you. And that then, through other mechanisms that I won't get into, that's sort of like the first domino to fall. And then the fat cell starts to spread the insulin resistance to the liver, to the pancreas, to the muscle tissue. And when those three tissues in particular start to become insulin resistant, now we start to struggle with glucose levels and we start pushing into type 2 diabetes. Okay, now to bring that back to women, really briefly, sorry for the little excursion there, but I think it's helpful. So why did I say earlier that estradiol, with the main estrogen, why does that give a woman kind of a metabolic immunity? It's because estradiol has the ability to stimulate the growth of new fat cells, which a woman may curse, and it doesn't happen everywhere. It is unique to her subcutaneous fat tissue. So subcutaneous is the fat tissue that we store right beneath the skin. Women generally do more of that. That is a very healthy place to store fat. So it's the estradiol that's primarily telling her to store fat in her subcutaneous space. In the male counterpart, it's his androgen levels that is telling him to store it on his belly.
Deeper back to the belly.
Yeah, that's right. In the visceral space, most especially. And then with the woman, with her high estradiol levels, when the estrogens are elevated, not only is she storing her fat subcutaneously, but it's also enabling that when the fat cell starts to get a little big, before it ever becomes insulin resistant and pro-inflammatory, estradiol is saying, okay, you've reached your limit. Let's make another one now. And then you are going to help carry. So this daughter fat cell is going to help carry the metabolic burden. Whereas in the male, he doesn't have that ability generally. Genetically, sometimes people do, but the vast majority of the time, he won't. His body is saying, your fat cell's getting bigger and bigger. Too bad. You just got to carry the load. And now you're becoming insulin resistant and pro-inflammatory. And now now you have heart disease and fatty liver disease, et cetera. Whereas the woman just continues to gain body fat and she's perfectly healthy. So that's one component to it, where her estradiol levels are actually telling her body to store fat in a healthy way. But at the same time, this is shocking to most women. Women are fat burning machines. At any given moment, a woman is burning 40% more fat than her male counterpart is. Now, she may say, well, why do I have more fat than him too? Estradiol is stimulating the breakdown of fat, and estradiol is actually stimulating the burning of the fat, because those are not the same thing. So estradiol is both stimulating the breakdown of the stored fat from the fat cell, sending it out to a tissue like the muscle, telling the muscle, I've got some fat for you here, you got to burn it. So at any moment, a woman is burning more fat than a man is. In fact, this is so substantial that if you are looking at an uncommon marker in the blood called free fatty acids, which is not the same as triglycerides or cholesterol or anything else, it's uncommonly measured. You have to have a different metric for men versus women because the woman is going to be like 50% higher than the man. And that's her baseline state. She's just burning so much more fat than he is. And that's all estradiol. Now, I'd mentioned progesterone. Progesterone actually starts to complicate it a little bit. And it's that one time of month during ovulation where her progesterone levels will go high and then come back down depending on what happens. If she just has a normal ovulation without any pregnancy, it went up and down. If, of course, there was fertilization and implantation and now the pregnancy is moving, now it's staying high. But during that one period of time, for those couple days or few days, progesterone has two effects. Progesterone wants fat cells to stop burning fat, so it starts to offset the estradiol in that particular effect. They're complementary in other ways. And at the same time, it starts to stimulate hunger. So a woman, it is literally a central nervous system effect of progesterone at the brain, stimulating appetite, promoting hunger. And then at the same time at the fat cell, telling the fat cells, hey, stop breaking down fat and hold on to it. Because we might get pregnant. And once we get pregnant, the whole metabolic milieu changes from one of fat burning to one of storing. And that's, of course, because the woman bears the metabolic burden of reproduction. And so that's her way of just kind of stockpiling the calories, where she's committing to, growing a little human, and then in ideal circumstances, feeding that little human for up to a year afterwards. And she's got to have a lot of energy on her body because that is a metabolic marathon. Her metabolic rate goes higher during pregnancy than at any other time in her life, because she's just so busy growing another human and then feeding that little human. Anyway, that is a tremendously longer answer than I expected, but it allows us to bring in the nuance of the fat cell. And that's what we have to understand in order to appreciate the metabolic advantage that a woman has in staying metabolically healthy, being very, very metabolically flexible, being very insulin sensitive, but those are kind of redundant. It's because of what her sex hormones are doing at her fat cells, as opposed to what his primary sex hormones, his androgens, are doing at his fat cells. It ends up giving her the advantage. What makes the man bigger, faster, stronger also makes him more susceptible to metabolic disarray. And what makes the woman more suited to have the primary responsibility for reproduction, of course, it also gives her an immunity to some of that, the necessity of the reproductive metabolic burden.
Yeah. Yeah. Which then, of course, if we follow it through the woman's life and she hits menopause now where she's not secreting those normal estradiol levels, then all of those good things you just mentioned go away. And we see that pretty clearly in women's lab results. We see as their estradiol levels fall, we'll see their metabolic markers, their insulin resistance frequently go up, and they'll say, I haven't done anything. Like, where's this coming from? And we'll see the insulin resistance come up. So,
in fact, let me just add one final comment about the fat cell. Then is that it's interesting to me as a scientist to note that at around that same time that the woman ovulation has ended and she's going into menopause, that tends to be roughly around the same time that we start losing fat cells, which sounds strange, but remember, fat cells are kind of the buffer. Like if we can store fat in fat cells, we're metabolically healthy. It's when the fat cells start to run out of room that metabolic consequences follow, like insulin resistance. Throughout the life of a normal person, as we are born, going through infancy, childhood, and puberty, the number of fat cells is going up. We're making more and more fat cells until the end of adolescence. So mid to late teens in girls, late teens, even early 20s in boys, because boys are just later in this regard. Then, for the most part, the number of fat cells a person has is pretty static, for the most part. Even in women, there's little changes in fat mass, of course, going up or down, but that's mostly due to size, but women can make more. But it's generally mostly flatline until around late 50s into 60s, depending on the person. Now we stop, during that whole 40 or so years, for every one fat cell that dies, we just replace it. And that's about a 10-year cycle. Fat cells live for about 10 years. They're not immortal. but they're long-lived. And then at the end of that time period that I noted, then we don't replace our fat cells. So the number of fat cells we have starts to drop. Now, lest we think that's a good thing, remember, it's the size of the fat cell that matters most. It's not how much fat you have. And so if a person continues to eat and live a lifestyle that wanted their body to store that much fat in the first place, as we start losing fat cells, and in the case of a woman, losing the protective effect of estradiol in particular, that is really a moment to be careful metabolically, because then she has the risk of really growing her remaining fat cells. And the bigger the fat cell gets, the more insulin resistance and its consequences follow.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there is just this sort of snowball effect as women go through menopause, and there are ways around it. So it's not a doom and gloom, but it is worth being aware of that when people feel like, gosh, it feels like my body has changed suddenly. Yeah, yep. It really has, and everything in it has. Hey there, listeners. Just a quick break to tell you about something that could make a big difference in your life or the life of a woman you care about. Here at Uplift for Her, we specialize in integrative women's health, offering comprehensive support for every stage of life. Whether you're navigating menopause and need expert HRT advice, looking to shed those stubborn pounds, or seeking for help with your mental well-being, we've got you covered. We combine the best of traditional and functional medicine with personalized health coaching and dietitian support here at our Salt Lake City-based clinic. We ensure that your unique needs are met with the care and expertise you deserve. At Uplift for Her, we're here to help you feel your best inside and out. Ready to take the next step in your health journey? Visit us at upliftforher.com or give us a call today. We have services available for those of you living in the state of Utah and some services available for those of you outside of Utah. Now let's get back to the episode. Okay, well, so in your book, Why We Get Sick, it's an excellent book, and I would really encourage people to read it because the whole first half of the book, or third of the book, talks about the effects insulin resistance has by system in our bodies, and it's very interesting and very enlightening. Let's maybe summarize and say insulin resistance is bad for you.
Yeah.
It stresses the body. It ages the body really much more quickly than without it. Is there anything else you want to kind of summarize just about why insulin resistance is bad before we kind of move into what we do about it?
No. In fact, I will give very, very brief summary, which is a tall order for a guy like me. But my hope with all that part of the book and what you and I have been touching on here and what you just alluded to is that I want people to appreciate that as much as chronic diseases will have unique origins, I can imagine the person who opens their medicine cabinet, they take their medication for their diabetes, medication for blood pressure, medication for infertility, thinking that each of these diseases is totally unrelated. And yet that's just not true. That while they may have individual stimuli, they do have one big thing in common. And my primary professional goal is just to try to bring the focus on that with the thought that if we can resolve this one problem of insulin resistance, which is what we'll get into now, then all of those other problems start to go down.
Yeah. And I mean, you don't need my backing to that, but I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think as I see patients in clinic with multiple chronic diseases, it can feel really overwhelming. Like, gosh, my body is just falling apart. So in one way, I hope people feel hope in saying on Instagram, there's 18,000 things that you should be doing. No, don't worry about the 18,000 things. Worry about the insulin resistance, and there will be a happy snowball effect that comes from there.
Amen.
So,
yes.
Good. So let's talk about that then so people can have some hope. Since we've just demonstrated how bad this is and 88% of us have some amount of this, give me first the sort of big overview picture, and then we'll kind of go into detail a little bit more. What do people, maybe let's start. How do people know if they have insulin resistance other than assuming, since it's 88% of people or so? Yeah.
So it's not a wrong assumption, of course, because of the statistics that are so sobering. It depends on how thorough a person is able to get. If you have a clinician like you who's able to look at various markers like fasting insulin or surrogate markers like the triglyceride to HDL ratio, which is shockingly reliable. Yeah. If someone has a fasting insulin level of 6 or less, I generally consider that to be a good sign. But insulin is a hormone with a bit of a rhythm, so it's possible you catch it at a bit of a higher point. So if it's up to the mid-teens, it may be okay, but all the more reason to then look at another marker like the triglyceride to HDL ratio, which is less volatile. If you've gone into a fasted state, it's going to be pretty stable. You want your triglycerides divided by HDL to be a number that's less than 1.5. You want that answer to be less than 1.5. If it is, that's a good sign. So those are
that's
some
on
blood
regular
tests.
lab values. So
Yeah,
if you go to your
right.
doctor, they get a cholesterol panel. That one's not a fancy one. That's there, but most doctors won't bring up the triglyceride to HDL ratio.
Mm-mm.
But it's right there. If you have an LDL level, it's in there. You can look it up yourself.
Totally agree. In fact, I co-authored a paper suggesting that if statins have any benefit, I don't mean to be overly controversial here. We have generally a medical culture where we just look at the LDL and then just, your LDL's high, let's go on a statin. We reviewed the evidence finding that if LDL was high, but the triglyceride to HDL ratio was low, then the benefit of statins was negligible to nil. Now, I'm not giving medical advice, of course, here. You can look at my study, anyone who's listening. But it was the triglyceride to HDL ratio that really determined any value of this very widespread medication. So those are a couple blood tests you could do. If your blood pressure is high, the most common cause of high blood pressure, this is especially relevant in men, is insulin resistance. And then maybe I'll just transition quickly into one that you can actually see, which is the skin. If people will probably quickly know what I'm talking about. Around the neck, around that kind of collar line of the neck, you can look for two different skin problems. The most common one that's a reflection of insulin resistance is skin tags. These little kind of teeny little mushrooms. It's not like a rounded mound or a mole. It's like a little column, a little pillar, or a little mushroom of skin just kind of sticking right up. Those skin tags, very strong sign of insulin resistance. And then the second, the name of it is called acanthosis nigricans, which is just a phenomenon where the skin starts to feel kind of like tissue papery, crinkly, and it gets a little darker. Now, depending on the pigment of the skin, naturally, you may not be able to see the pigment change, but it gets a little darker and it gets a little kind of crinkly, like you've taken tissue paper and crinkled it up and then spread it back out. Once again, right along that neckline. That can also happen along the armpits and or the groin. Generally, it's wherever skin starts to kind of rub. But those are, right at kind of eye level observations that you can see and be pretty confident that if you see those things, you're seeing a manifestation of insulin resistance.
And then also most doctors will check a hemoglobin A1C, right, is the name of it. And then a fasting glucose is also somewhat common. It's at least easy to access. Are those ones that you recommend looking at?
Yeah, I do. Although I just am quick to note that glucose is a later marker that to really appreciate insulin resistance, kind of coming back to the original definition that we outlined or started with, it's when the body needs more insulin. But in the case of glucose, it takes more insulin, but it is working well enough to keep the glucose in check. And so one of the problems that I have with insulin resistance and metabolic markers is that we have a very glucose-centric paradigm, that we're always looking at the glucose, but there's evidence to suggest that the insulin can have been elevated for up to 10 or 20 years before the glucose ever changes. So glucose is a very late marker, which is why I generally don't focus on it, because you're always going to get it. But if you're waiting for glucose, fasting, or A1C, it's going to be late. That the person may have already been struggling with high insulin for up to 10 years. And then eventually the insulin starts to lose the war. Now the glucose levels are climbing. So glucose is absolutely going to be a marker, but it's going to be a delayed marker. So all the more reason to focus on the earlier signals like insulin itself and the triglyceride to HDL ratio.
Can you have a falsely negative insulin where it looks like it's normal, but actually it's not?
That's a good question. It would be very, very uncommon, only because it's generally impossible to have insulin resistance without elevated insulin. Now, again, you could have a state where the person's insulin is so volatile that you just caught it at the lowest of the low. And maybe it was in the low teens, which is what I've said before. It can maybe be good. It's kind of like an orange light or yellow light. Is it actually problematic? Rather than like green light is good or red light is bad. But all the more reason to then look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio or some of these other surrogate markers.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think I do the whole constellation of those, and they're a little bit all over the map. It's not super black and white. Sometimes you have one that looks good or two that looks good, and then two that don't look good. And you really are looking at the whole picture. So it's nice to know which ones to prioritize in the insulin and triglycerides. So now we spend the rest of this talking about hope and what do we do about it? So what are the overarching kind of pillars of lifestyle change that people need to be aware of when correcting and or avoiding insulin resistance?
Yeah, right. It is so nice to be able to kind of transition to the happy ending, because as much as it sounds like a bit of a horror story, if it is, it does at least have a nice resolution, which is that insulin resistance is not only totally preventable, but totally reversible. We published a report with a local clinical team here, finding in 11 women with full-blown type 2 diabetes, in just 90 days, and type 2 diabetes is just the insulin resistance where it's now high glucose too. The type 2 diabetes was gone without a single pill popped, no medication.
Did you say 11 days?
Sorry, 90 days in 11 women. I might have said 11 days.
I probably got it wrong. 90 days.
So it was 11 women, exclusively women, and it was 90 days. In 90 days with no medication, there was no amount of clinical evidence anymore of the disease. They had reversed their type 2 diabetes completely.
I'm assuming without massive amounts of weight loss per se. They weren't.
Yeah. Well, only as much as you would maybe get in 90 days,
right.
So kind of a modest amount. So just to answer the solution and the prevention, I'll briefly revisit the three causes. And so, of course, there are kind of non-caloric, non-dietary influences like sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation can absolutely cause insulin resistance, no question. You sleep poorly, your insulin resistance is demonstrably elevated the next day. And so that is something to be mindful of. What are your sleep habits? How's your sleep hygiene? Inflammation, what is the air you breathe? Now, these are all, they can kind of feel a little overwhelming, and that's okay, because they're also the ones that matter a little less. Like what is your inflammation? Are you eating foods that are harming your gut and increasing gut permeability or leaky gut? Do you have an autoimmune disease? When those things are up, you're going to have a little more insulin resistance. But again, those pale in comparison to the high insulin. The main intervention is how can we lower insulin, and that is entirely what we eat and how often we eat it. So I generally outline, I guess, 4 pillars, but you can almost distill it down to 2. The first, I believe, is the most important, so I would suggest starting with it, which is control carbs. Now, this is not to say we can't eat them at all. I want to be very, very clear, because it seems people are so eager to kind of be offended at certain ideas these days. I'm not waging war on carbohydrates, not at all. What I am saying is that most people, 70% of all calories consumed globally are carbohydrates. So this is the thing we eat by far the most of. Unfortunately, particularly in the West and increasingly in the Middle East and East Asia, those carbs are coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. So they're very processed starches and sugars. That's what I mean by control. We've just got to stop getting our carbs from these processed sources. Whole fruits and vegetables, eat them, enjoy them as much as you want. But note that that's not the same. That is not the same. Eating whole fruits and vegetables is not the same as opening up a bag of chips or having a bowl of cereal or having a pint of ice cream. Now, the tragedy is, of course, of all of the macronutrients, and I'll get into the other 2 in just a moment, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, there's no evidence to suggest humans have cravings or addictive tendencies to proteins and fats. It's only carbs, either carbs alone or carbs with fat, but never fat alone and never fat with protein. We don't have any, like no one is sitting around on a Saturday night craving a plate of bacon and eggs. It just, if only that happened. If only I could feel that myself. No, we want something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy, and that means it's coming from a bag or a box with a barcode. So the first rule, control carbs, especially in the evening. As a little tangent, you do not want to go to bed hyperglycemic. If you've spiked your glucose when you're going to bed, you activate what's called your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response. And now you're lying in bed, you're hot, because your body's amped up, your heart is beating harder and faster, and you're wondering, why are you so anxious? You're not anxious. You just activated your sympathetic nervous system because you went to bed hyperglycemic.
Because you gave yourself fuel and your body was like,
too much. And the body's thinking, I need to try to get rid of this. It's time to go for a run or go for a workout. No, it was actually time to go to bed. And did you mess that timing up. So control carbs, that is rule number 1. And then the other 2 kind of go together, which is prioritize protein, make sure you're getting high quality protein. And generally high quality is going to come from animal sources. And if it's plant protein, then you just have to focus on fermented plant protein, because plant proteins are generally going to be a little poorer quality. And I know that's also unpopular these days to talk about. But prioritize protein, and then don't fear fat. Don't be afraid of fat. We have a very fat phobic culture. But if the fat is coming from fruits or animals, then we as humans are well suited to eat them. And the fruit fats are coconuts, avocados, olives. Enjoy them. Be very careful with refined seed oils or so-called vegetable oils. Those are very harmful in a way that is just too much to get into right now.
Just ages the body more.
It sure does. Yep. And so then the 4th rule, once those, and I do think the timing is important. You manage your macros first. Control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat. And fat and protein always come together in nature. Well, at least there's no such thing as protein alone. So when I say don't fear fat, largely I mean don't fear the fat that comes with those proteins. It's designed to come together. When humans eat protein and fat together, we digest the protein better, and it's more anabolic. There are human studies to show that if a human eats protein alone, there's a certain degree of muscle growth that can happen following a workout. If a person eats that protein with fat, it's even bigger. And so don't fear the fat that comes with the protein. Okay, once the macros are managed, that is going to bring down insulin very, very well. Then the person can choose whether they go on to that 4th step, which is a structure of frequent fasting. Now, that can mean whatever works for the person. I sometimes am reluctant to even invoke fasting because it elicits an immune response in some people, but it's so subject to interpretation. It can really play on eating disorders. And so as much as I'm an advocate of fasting, I will simply say, as much as people focus on the length of the fast, how you end your fast matters much more than how long you fast. So if a person has a habit of 24-hour fasting, and then they just binge on junk food and they eat themselves sick, they feel ashamed, they feel guilt, self-hatred, self-loathing, and they just say, I'm going to do better tomorrow. And they do the same thing. It becomes kind of a glamorous version of bulimia, to be very blunt about it and crass. And so that's my point. How you end your fast matters much, much more than how long you fast. And so not everyone will find that fasting works for them. I find it works for me. My wife hates it. She is no longer having children, but she will say, I wish I were still breastfeeding so that I wouldn't have to feel bad about not fasting. And, we sort of joke about it. She hates fasting. It is very hard for her to do. I can just shrug and do a 36-hour fast and I barely notice it. Men and women are different. My wife is particularly, for her, she's still ovulating. Her progesterone will go up. At any moment, these hormones are higher than they are in my body. I absolutely believe that while women can certainly fast very, very well, in fact, I think some of the evidence of that is in the fact that when you look at ultra endurance events, this is the one event where women can consistently beat men. Mm-hmm. In anything else where it's power and speed, men have the natural advantage. If a person's gone through male puberty, that's an advantage that will never go away. But when it comes to these ultra endurance events, which is just hugely reliant on fat burning, a woman can perform better than a man and outrun him. And so a woman is built, she's built to be able to fast because she burns fat so well, and fat is such a long fuel. It's like a diesel engine. However, depending on her ovulation state, depending on her menopausal status, which is sort of plays into that, fasting can be harder. So anyway, back to the point. I mentioned that 4th point of some structured frequent fasting with a little bit of caution and even trepidation, because I don't think it's necessary. and it doesn't really work for everyone anyway. So I really emphasize the kind of manage macros, those first 3 pillars, the trinity of managing your macros matters much, much more. And then when it does come to fasting, I just encourage people to be careful, be mindful of your own past, your own eating habits, and perhaps struggles, and then really focus on how you end your fast. Have that be very structured. If necessary, recruit outside help and say, I'm ending my fast at 6 p.m. or 8 a.m. or whatever. This is what I'm planning on eating. Can you please just make sure I just do this? And then if I'm hungry 30 minutes later, this is what I'll eat after, because it just becomes too easy to really turn that into a binge purge cycle. It's a very slippery slope.
Yeah, I love that. I just want to reiterate a couple of those things. So the carbohydrates first, aiming in I think when some people hear this, they just want to cut all carbs out, and you will feel terrible and your body will crave it and you'll go through almost withdrawals. I like to focus on the second 2 that you said first, which is making sure that you're getting that adequate protein before you even think about anything else, making sure you're getting adequate fat, and then also getting adequate fiber with eating the rainbow and getting all those phytonutrients and the vegetables in, right? And then come back and switch those carbohydrates from the processed carbs into the fiber-rich carbs that we find in plants. And then really that's where people don't get the sugar cravings and don't get the energy crashes. Once you're fed, I think oftentimes we focus too much on don't eat, not you, but oftentimes we hear a lot of don't eat this, don't eat this, don't eat this. And the point is that the body wants to be fueled. The body wants to be fed. So feed the body, fuel the body, and then cut out the extra. And along that same line, I think that's the key with fasting for women, is understanding it's just as much about how you're fueling compared to how you're fasting. You know, you can't fast if you haven't fueled. If you're in a chronic calorie restriction, then you don't get to fast. That's just not how it goes. Yep. You have to be fueled. You have to be in a state of safety. You can't be running, a marathon and running 1,000,000 miles a week and then go fast. Mm-hmm. You have to understand the right timing and context to bring that additional strain on the body. And it can be really productive, but you should think about and understand the nuance with it. And then it can be really, really beneficial. So I love all of those.
Yeah. I think it's so important. You have such a perspective that I can't have for multiple reasons, most especially the clinical work, in addition to the personal living here, of course. But I one of the reasons I focus on that so cautiously, that 4th step, is because women are just so much more inclined to just go too far with it and to take a little bit of a good thing in this one regard. Sure. Men just, I'm going to fast, but I know when I'm done and I don't really want to do it. I don't want to get too thin. I want to keep my muscle. And so, a guy will generally be a little more capable of regulating himself in that regard, unfortunately. So I think this is a proper amount of caution and just understanding the fasting component. While it can be revolutionary in someone's health, it's just such a fine line as well.
Yeah. Let me just go through a couple kind of rapid fire questions, because I think there are some things that just come up all the time. And so the first one is diet soda. There's questions about it doesn't spike insulin, but it's still not good for you. With regards to insulin resistance, and we'll keep this just brief, but yay or nay on that? Big deal, small deal?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a small deal. Now, I know people feel very strongly about diet soda and aspartame in particular. I do not. I think any evidence of it being a cancer concern, I personally, as a scientist, believe that is not justified from the evidence. That you give that much of anything to these animals, that they're all going to get cancer no matter what you're giving them, because it's such high doses. When it comes to an insulin response, aspartame won't have any effect, and frankly, the vast majority of sweeteners don't either.
And that's the same approach I take, is leave it on there. If that's what you're drinking, leave it there. Do everything else first. And then, there are other health reasons, but it's not a big role in this. This, we'll try to answer it quickly. How much does genetics play a role here? Are there people who just will not be able to do this with medication, or is it more epigenetics? Is it more the lifestyle than the genes?
Yeah, it's definitely more lifestyle than gene, which is both good news and bad. Good because it does mean you can do something about it, but bad because it means you have to do something about it if you want change. But there's no question that while there is no clear gene culprit to say, oh, you're more insulin resistant than you. That's never been done. There is no question that there is a familial pattern.
Yeah.
That if you come from a family where mom or dad had type 2 diabetes, you absolutely are more insulin resistant, even right now, than your friend who does not have a parent with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
So if you have a first degree relative with type 2 or gestational diabetes, which is just type 2 diabetes of pregnancy, basically, then you absolutely are further on that spectrum of insulin resistance than someone else. But again, the good news is you can do something about it. And if anything, I would just hope that could be a little extra motivation, but it will mean you've got to be a little more diligent.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you a fan of the 5 small meals or the 2 to 3 regular meals? I hear this a lot, like make sure you're eating every 2 hours. I'm not a fan, but
I'm not either. No, I think that's a way. I think that actually is a large degree combined. The frequent eating combined with our constant carb consumption is largely
fat.
That's brought us to where we are.
Mm-hmm.
The human body is not meant to eat every 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
We have to have periods of fasting, even if it's just a few hours. And so I am much bigger advocate of letting your insulin come down. And to me, I say fasted, and we just got done talking about fasting. To me, an endocrine / biomedical / metabolism scientist, I look at fasting as a state of insulin being high or low.
Yeah.
If insulin is high, you are in a fed state.
Yep.
If insulin is low, you are in a fasted state. Even if it's in the middle of the day and it's been 4 hours since you ate, if you have to have periods of time where your insulin comes down, that is the key to healthy metabolism. Metabolism is a term that encompasses both the building up or anabolism and the breaking down or catabolism. Mm-hmm. Healthy metabolism is a balance of those processes, building up, which insulin wants to do all the time, and breaking down, which we can only do when insulin comes down. So I'm much more an advocate of condensing consumption.
Yeah, eat a meal and eat a good meal, and then
that's
don't
right,
bother.
and then be done.
And then you won't be hungry, and you won't have that energy crash.
Yep.
Last couple questions here. CGMs, continuous glucose monitors that we see with the little white circle on the back of people's arms. People are doing it more for biohacking. Big difference, small difference, big fan, not a big fan for a non-diabetic.
Yeah, I am a big fan. Because I have seen so many people who are able to make substantial lifestyle changes on their own without having me or you telling them what to do. They're able to look at their phone and see, oh my, look at what happened when I ate this, or I never sleep very well. And how interesting that now I see I spike my glucose up to 200 every night when I go to bed because I snack on these things. So the value of the CGM is I think it gives people a very objective insight into what they're actually doing, because as my wonderful father once taught me, humans are great self-deceivers. Mm-hmm. We trick ourselves into all kinds of deceit, thinking in cases of eating that we're doing better than we really are. The CGM sort of wipes out the potential for self-deceit. And so in that sense, I think it's tremendously useful.
We talk about insulin actually being the better marker. Do you think we'll get to a continuous insulin marker?
Oh, Mallory, you have no idea how big that question is. Yeah. That is like the $1 billion question. So I will say, being somewhat connected to that industry, there are multiple additional analytes that are coming out with continuous monitoring. Yeah. There are already continuous ketone monitors that you can get. There are going to be continuous lactate monitors coming out soon too, which I am interested in. The continuous hormone monitors, I'd say that's at least a decade away.
Yeah. We didn't do justice to the movement side of all of this. Will you just give a real quick, like, how should we just be moving in general?
Yeah. Well, you'll pardon me for saying this. Yeah. In fact, I'm often asked, what's the best exercise to improve insulin resistance? It's the one you'll do.
Yeah.
So it really is important that you are just moving. When we move the muscles, they're able to pull in glucose without insulin needing to tell them what to do. Mm-hmm. And indeed, high insulin is antithetical to exercise. Exercise is, I'm breaking down. I want to be catabolic right now. And so insulin has to come down to enable that to happen. And the more you're able to bring your insulin down, the more the body can resensitize to insulin. So I am a huge advocate. But for this audience of with mostly women, let me just make a plug. please, please, please do something that's helping you retain and build muscle.
Yep.
As much as it is the sort of the female default to just go on a walk or a jog, that's good. It's better than nothing, but spend some time trying to build up your muscle, because muscle mass is one of the great predictors of longevity and just optimal metabolic health.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I heard a conversation recently between some women, and they were discussing sort of the health advice that we hear about, you must do this and you must do this. And they kind of ended with like, it's just too much. It's just too much. Like, I hear you. I hear it's important. It's just too hard. I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to do that with my kids. What is your sort of plea or advice to, I mean, a lot of these women are very, very busy and busy moms or busy grandmas and have these busy lives. And yet, I think it's a misstep for us to dismiss this health information because it's just too much. But I sympathize too, because it is too much. It is hard. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Right. It can be overwhelming. Absolutely. If I could, I would just say pick a bookend of the day. Pick either your breakfast or your evening, and fix it. Yep. Just start with just one of those at the simplest. I used to always say just start with your breakfast, but more and more, I actually think it's probably more prudent if you can control your evening snacking. That is the hardest time, at least for me. Maybe it's a little too much confession. In old college habits where you would eat 3 bowls of cereal and just sort of shrug it off. I'm a cereal addict. I cannot moderate. It is this like descent into metabolic mayhem. If I try to convince myself, oh no, I'm just going to have a little bit. I'll just have a half a bowl. Nope, I can't. I cannot. It is easier for me to never even pour a single piece of cereal in the bowl than to stop at a half of one bowl. If I start, I don't stop until I'm sick, like a true addict. And so maybe I'm revealing a little too much here, but I'd say pick one part of the day, either breakfast to fix. That'll be easier because most people really aren't too hungry at breakfast. And so if that's the easier one, then start with that one. Or maybe even a little harder, start with your evening and just wipe out evening snacking. I guarantee you'll sleep better. And maybe that will lend itself to just having a better day the next day where you feel like you also have a little more control. So just pick one of those times of the day to fix. Start with that one.
I love that. That's the same advice I give. And just saying it again, the more fueled you are, the better fed you are, the easier that's going to be. If you're starving, it's going to be really hard not to go eat that thing that sounds amazing to you. So fuel yourself at the best time that you can get the food in, and then go from there. Okay, last question here is there any final kind of wrap up that you would want to give to the women listening about insulin resistance, metabolic health? Just sort of a summary, kind of just a final thought.
Yeah. I would just say, if you're anyone listening, sort of like my wife or my sisters, one of men's superpowers is we're not as hard on ourselves, that we're sort of okay with our foibles. And so I would perhaps just say, at the risk of sounding kind of cheesy, like be kind with yourself, and be kind even with your fat mass. That I'm amazed at the way how self-critical my wife is. And I'm looking at her thinking, bring that body over here, sweetheart. I'm like, so I don't know. That sounds kind of silly now that I'm saying it out loud, but I would just try to, accept the reality that the female body is literally designed to have more fat on it. Yeah. And that is for a beautiful reason. It is literally for the good of the species. It is entirely for reproduction. You have to have more fat to maintain your health, to maintain your bone mass. As much as we look at leptin as only a satiety hormone, that is not at all true. And leptin comes from fat tissue. For normal fertility and sexual function, you got to have high leptin. For normal bone mass, you got to have high leptin. For good mitochondrial health, you got to have high leptin. Leptin comes from fat. Women need more fat than men. So maybe I would just say, as much as we paint the picture of, helping control fat mass, which is necessary, also, maybe try to be a little more forgiving of what you've got, because I guarantee your male counterpart isn't upset about it, for what that may be worth. That's terrible to say.
Well, no, thank you so much. Your perspective is really helpful and you've taught us so much. I think it's been a really nice overview and with a lot of detail about insulin resistance. And I hope women do feel empowered and kind of both feel the nudge. There is some amount of urgency. We can't dismiss it and we can't really make light of it because it's too consequential, but it's doable. It's very, very doable. So
it sure is. Yeah. And so just bring it down to the smallest size. Start with those kind of manage macros and pick one part of the day to do it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. A huge thank you to our guest for sharing their insights and time with us. We are grateful for the incredible support from our sponsors and to all of you listening. We couldn't do this without you. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing on your favorite platform. You can find us on our website, upliftforher.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you love to listen. And if you found value here today, please share this episode with someone who would benefit from it. Leave us a comment or give us a review. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Thank you for being part of our community. Stay tuned for our next episode. This information is for educational purposes only and not intended to be medical advice.